All right, so today we're diving into something that's absolutely central to modern finance, the intangible economy. We're going to frame this as a tale of two completely different rulebooks, US GAAP and IFRS, and how they struggle to capture a company's most valuable but often invisible assets.
You know, this quote really nails it. It used to be all about the factories, the machinery, the stuff you could touch. But today, the real value is in things like software code, brand power, and customer data. The whole economic game has changed, big time.
And that right there, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How on earth do you reliably measure the value of a brand or a patent? This isn't just some philosophical debate. It's the core problem that these two massive accounting frameworks, US GAAP and IFRS, are wrestling with. And as we're about to see, they come up with some very, very different answers.
So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the invisible economy and the huge philosophical split between our two rulebooks. Then we'll get into the messy bought versus built problem, the deep divide on how to handle impairments, and what happens with assets that have finite versus indefinite lives. We'll even look at a super important test for R&D in mergers, and then finally we'll pull it all together. Okay, so let's meet our two main characters in this story. In one corner, you've got US GAAP. Think of GAAP as the skeptical gatekeeper. It loves clear, black and white rules and is super conservative. And in the other corner, we have IFRS, the economic realist. IFRS tries to show a company's true economic position, which, you guessed it, means there's a lot more room for judgment. Now, before we get into the drama, it's important to know they do agree on some things. Both systems start right here with this core definition. To even be considered an intangible asset, it has to be identifiable, meaning you can sell it or separate it from the company. You have to control it, usually through some kind of legal right. And obviously, it has to be expected to make you money in the future. So that's our common ground.
All right, now we get to the juicy part. Let's talk about the first major clash, what some people call the original sin of intangible accounting. It's this fundamental, massive difference in how the rules treat an asset you buy versus one you create yourself.
Now this is where it gets kind of wild. Imagine Company A buys Company B. As part of that deal, it gets to put all of Company B's brands and customer lists on its balance sheet at their fair value. But if Company A spends that exact same amount of money on marketing to build an identical brand from scratch, all of that spending just gets expensed. It never shows up as an asset. Think about that for a second. Two economically identical situations, two completely different accounting results.
And you see this bought versus built gap most clearly with research and development. US GAAP is super strict. It has a bright line rule, no gray areas, that says R&D is just too uncertain, so expense almost everything as it happens. IFRS, however, takes a more thoughtful approach. It splits the process. The early, pie-in-the-sky research phase gets expensed. But once a project hits the development phase and meets 6 strict criteria showing it's actually viable, well, then you have to capitalize those costs as an asset.
Okay, so we've managed to get some assets on the books. But what happens when things go south? When that asset loses value? This process is called impairment, and it's where we find the next huge philosophical battle between GAAP and IFRS.
US GAAP uses this two-step process that basically acts as a giant shield, protecting assets from being written down. The first step is the recoverability test. You compare the asset's book value to the raw sum of its future cash flows, without any discounting. It's like saying a dollar you'll get in 10 years is worth the same as a dollar in your pocket today, which, it isn't. This makes it a very, very easy test to pass, meaning a lot of economically impaired assets never get written down. Now, IFRS, it just cuts right to the chase. It skips that shield and goes straight to a real economic test. You compare the book value to its recoverable amount. And notice that value and use calculation, it's based on the present value of future cash flows. Using discounting makes the IFRS test way tougher and forces companies to face economic reality a lot sooner.
So what does this all mean for you when you're looking at a financial statement? Well, this table sums it up perfectly. US GAAP's two-step shield means impairments happen later and less often. IFRS's one-step economic test means they happen earlier and more frequently. Here's the key takeaway. If you see a US GAAP company taking an impairment, that's a huge red flag. It means things are so bad that the asset failed even that really easy first test.
Okay, so that's what happens when value drops. But what about just the normal life of an asset? Once it's on the balance sheet, its accounting journey really depends on its useful life. Is there a foreseeable end to its value, or could it just, last forever? The logic here is actually pretty simple, and both GAAP and IFRS are mostly on the same page. If an asset has a finite life, like a patent that expires, you spread its cost over that life. We call that amortization. But if an asset has an indefinite life, like a major trademark that could last forever, you don't amortize it. Instead, you have to test it for impairment every single year to make sure it's still worth what you say it is. But here's where they clash again, and it's a big one. What if an asset that you wrote down actually recovers its value? US GAAP is like, nope, no second chances. A write-down is forever. Once it's gone, it's gone. IFRS, staying true to its economic reality philosophy, says you have to reverse that loss if the value comes back. And it even lets companies revalue certain assets up to fair value. That's something that is absolutely forbidden under US GAAP.
Okay, so you might be thinking, these are just a bunch of abstract rules. Well, let me show you how they have huge real-world impacts, especially in the high-stakes world of mergers and acquisitions. We're going to look at something called in-process research and development, or IPR&D for short. So imagine this. A giant pharmaceutical company buys a small biotech startup. The only thing that startup really has is one promising new drug that's still being tested. The big question for the accountants becomes, what did we actually just buy? Did we buy a whole business or just one single asset? The answer changes everything.
US GAAP has this little rule. They call it the screen test. It's basically a quick check that says if almost all the value of what you bought is tied up in one single thing, like that one drug, then it's not a business combination. You just bought an asset. And this simple classification is a tripwire with billion-dollar consequences. And this right here, this is the billion-dollar difference. If the deal is classified as a business combination, everyone agrees. You put the value of that R&D on the books as an asset. But if it fails that US GAAP screen test and gets called an asset acquisition, the rules go haywire. IFRS still says you can capitalize it, but US GAAP forces the buyer to expense the entire value immediately. Boom. Your net income for the year could be completely wiped out, all because of an accounting classification. All right. We've been through a lot, from the original sin to M&A drama, so let's boil this all down. When you're looking at a company's financials, what do you really need to remember from all this?
First, always remember the recognition gap. A company's best, most valuable assets, if they're built internally, often have a book value of 0. Second, the impairment signal. A write-down under US GAAP is a much bigger deal than one under IFRS. And finally, remember the core philosophies. GAAP is conservative, rules-based, and permanent. IFRS is economic, principles-based, and dynamic.
And that really leaves us with one big final question to chew on. As our economy is more and more driven by ideas and brands and data, which of these two ways of thinking, the conservative gatekeeper or the economic realist, do you believe tells the truer story of a company's value? There's no easy answer, but it's the question that's shaping the entire future of financial reporting.